I thought I'd take advantage of the big screen to show some nice pictures, and then I found out my talk was really, really long, so I had to remove loads of them. So obviously, in the IT security world these days, we see huge amounts of investment. We've got dedicated security teams, we've got some really cool tooling. Like companies have healthy security budgets, like it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. On the other hand, we've got OT security, where it's almost the polar opposite. For years, OT networks have ticked along, like running our critical infrastructure, but using really legacy kit, unsupported operating systems. Like we laugh at networks that are running Windows XP, but the reality is there's a lot of older stuff out there as well. Nothing's ever been patched or updated, and they just tick along, completely forgotten with no cybersecurity budget. Yet, despite this, it's not the OT networks that are getting compromised left, right, and centre. Like, barely a day goes by where we don't hear about a new significant incident in the IT world. So the fact that there's an awful lot of push from the IT world for us to better secure our OT networks, I find a really interesting dynamic. And I'm not saying that the OT network guys have got it right, but part of the reason I've decided it's really worth me talking about this topic is for the last several years working in the OT space, I've seen an awful lot of drive to lift and shift approaches from the IT world into the OT world. And some of them absolutely great, but a lot of the time there's just a bit of a lack of understanding of OT that means they won't necessarily work. And I think if we continue to go down that pathway, I think things will end badly. Now, my day job mostly is crafting tailored defences for really quite interesting networks. So I'm in a really privileged position. I get to play with some very cool kit. I've never played with that terminal, but the type of kit that exists there. And I think it's easy for me to say we shouldn't just lift and shift IT stuff into OT networks. But if people like myself don't come and share what goes on in an OT network, then how are the people like yourselves who are going to help us secure those networks going to make informed decisions? So firstly, for those not familiar, we typically see the oil and gas industry in a few different streams. You've got upstream, midstream, downstream. Upstream, think oil rigs, drilling, that type of thing. Midstream, you've got kind of the transportation, so tankers, pipelines, that type of thing. And then you've got downstream, which is where we're going to focus. So think storage, refining, delivering things to the end customers. So securing the OT networks of fuel depots, terminals, refineries. This picture here is a picture of the Buncefield oil depot in Hemel Hempstead in the UK. If you hadn't guessed, I'm from the UK. This isn't a depot that I've worked with or even one that I know that well. But I'm showing it to you for two reasons. The first reason is Google Earth shows quite a nice picture of it. So on the left here, you've got the skids, so that's where your tankers will load and unload. And then on the right, you've got your tank storage, which is where your product's held. And then you've got intricate piping and everything that kind of joins it all together. The second reason for showing you this picture is because in 2005, there was a relatively significant incident at this fuel depot. It was an explosion, measured 2.4 on the Richter scale, and it was felt up to about 28 miles away. The resulting fire burned for 5 days, and I think even now, it's the largest peacetime fire ever seen in Europe. It wasn't a cybersecurity incident. What happened was the tanks overflowed, resulting in a fuel-air mixture, which then ignited. Like it's reported that the high-level like switch that should have shut off the supply as the tanks were loading failed, and it just resulted in overflow of petrol or gasoline, which resulted in the fuel air vapor. Now, I think the reports were there was about 300 tons of petrol or gasoline that spilled down the side of the tank that caused the explosion, which ignited. But basically, that's what a fuel depot looks like. Obviously, we need to have a bit of think about the tech that exists within the fuel depots as well and fuel terminals, which is what I needed to do when I first started kind of on this journey. So my first approach was basically to split things into a few different categories. The first category I wanted to focus on was the stuff that was very specific in the task that it carried out. So the things that absolutely weren't going to have a patch Tuesday and security guidelines, and they probably weren't applying security in any way, shape or form. I basically saw those as the things I'm going to be able to do very little with if they're deployed in the field. So things like PLCs, RTUs, loading arms, fuel pumps, that type of thing. Now, conveniently for me, that married really nicely to what we have in the OT world, which is a model we call Purdue, which defines 5 different levels of operation. And this type of kit sat really nicely in kind of level 0, level 1 of that Purdue model. Now, the Purdue model wasn't designed as a cybersecurity model. It was designed as kind of different layers of operation, predominantly focused on kind of safety and resilience. But as cyber people, we can understand how that actually quite nicely marries to segmentation. The other areas that I was interested in, actually I was less interested in IT stuff, but this is the OT firewall. So the other side of the OT firewall, we've got our IT kit. I wasn't so interested in the IT kit itself, but what I was interested in was the communications that come between the IT network and the OT network. Predominantly because, like, if I had my way, we'd segment the two and nothing would speak to each other. But realistically, that's infeasible, that's not possible, for reasons kind of we'll delve into a little bit more. But ultimately, I wanted to have a situation whereby if IT world got massively hit by a ransomware incident, we could segment the OT networks off and we could continue to operate our fuel terminals without any fear of disruption or problems as a result of the IT incident. And then the final category we've got is kind of the level 2, level 3 stuff. And this is the stuff that is far more general purpose than the things that existed in the lower levels. So you've got things like your SCADA, your engineering PC. Essentially, they're OT systems, but they're sat on more general purpose operating systems. So you'll find Windows or Linux and things like that. So things we're a lot more familiar with. But that's all well and good. But the main thing we're all thinking at the moment is, so how do we blow up a fuel terminal using cyber? So we're going to explore that a little bit, and we're going to try and replicate the Buncefield incident, except this time using cyber means, which means we need to understand the tank storage that we have. So this is my very crude drawing of a tank storage system. And to the left, we've got our tank gauging, and that's where kind of our real-time readings of the environment come from. So these will be measuring the levels within our tank storage. They'll be feeding it perhaps through to the SCADA or perhaps through to the PLCs. But if you've ever seen SCADA screens in fuel terminals, we'll typically have little images of tank storage, and you'll see the fill level. That's kind of where that data is going to come from. And then to the right, we've got the overfill sensors. So these are the safety systems, and they're the systems that we saw fail at Buncefield. Obviously, since Buncefield, there's been some review of how all of this works, and things will have changed. But typically, you'll have your high alarm, or high warning, high alarm. So your alarm's going to be a closed loop system. So if it triggers, you're probably going to shut down the system so you don't continue to fill the tank up. Now, being safety systems, they'll typically be out of band, and this is a thing that's probably worth being mindful of if you go work in OT environments, is sometimes you'll share some really critical findings with engineers, and they'll seem a little bit dismissive because they'll talk about, the safety systems will protect that. And please don't see that as engineers being dismissive, but actually, they're not cyber people. Their primary focus isn't on the cool stuff that you've done with cyber. They're actually on making sure people don't die. So in their mind, what they're doing is going, could this result in a catastrophic situation if someone exploited that specific vulnerability? And if the answer is no, because the safety systems would save us, then at the moment, that's good enough for them. Doesn't mean they're not going to fix the cyber issue, but it just means that, just be mindful their focus might be in a slightly different place. So with our understanding of tank storage, how do we blow up the facility? Now, really conveniently for me, just over a week ago, BitSite pushed out a bunch of advisories for vulnerabilities they'd found in automatic tank gauging systems, so the tank gauging systems that we've got here. I've not really had a chance to delve into those, but broadly speaking, to me, they look like vulnerabilities in web management interfaces. We've got some score in 10 and CVSS scoring, so pretty critical. And we've got OS command injection. So let's look at these as essentially we can gain full control of the tank gauging system. So let's assume that one of those, let's assume that our tank gauging is one of those affected systems, and it's affected by those vulnerabilities. For the sake of not getting stuck at this point, let's just assume that there's another flaw with our overfill sensors. Let's assume there's been some sabotage or something, because actually, for us as cyber people, that's a little bit of an awkward one, because they're a bit out of band and they're a bit difficult for us to get to. That's not to say there's not ways of doing it, but it's going to take us a little while to get through there. So you know what, let's assume there's been some supply chain thing that means at particular times they don't trigger or something like that. So we've got our tank gauging system that's talking to the PLCs, talking to the SCADA, doing its thing, delivering its readings. We know the tank gauging systems are vulnerable to some of these exploits, so we fire off our exploit and drop a payload that means the tank gauging systems never report over a certain level or something like that. But this hits a pretty major challenge, which is how on earth do we access the tank gauging systems in the first place? Because they're probably sat down in level 0, level 1. They're not going to be widely accessible. Even if we assume they're Ethernet based and not sat behind some serial connectivity or whatever, they're not going to be easy to get to. So perhaps we need to compromise the SCADA, because that might give us a pathway through to it, or maybe we hit the engineering PC. Perhaps we hit the engineering PC to compromise the SCADA or to go through. Who knows? There's potential routes. But the thing is, with all of our routes through to 0 and 1, we kind of have to go through the higher levels, through the level 2, level 3. And when we looked at some of our facilities, that theme was very true for everything that we were looking at if we wanted to hit the lower levels. So we kind of built a mindset of, well, let's not worry about this stuff so much, because if we can detect the positioning activities of an adversary over here and keep an eye on any comms back and forth there, then we're in a better place than if we sit there and try and keep an eye on all of this stuff that's horrendously riddled with insecurities and just complete lack of security by design. And that actual mindset of the level 2, level 3 stuff rings true with real incidents as well. So if you think Stuxnet was executed by a compromise of the engineering PC, which led to reprogramming of the PLC and modification of the PLC. So in real life, we're seeing things come through the higher levels to the lower levels. So it's a thing to just be very, very mindful of. And a thing I'll throw in as well, because it resonates with some of the things other speakers have said today, but OT networks, if you compare them to IT networks, OT networks are really deterministic. Like, you're protecting a process, whereas in IT, we tend to protect systems and users, whereas in OT, we're protecting a process, and actually it's a relatively quiet environment. If you understand the process, you can protect it really, really well. If you don't understand the process, you're kind of a little bit stuck. So we know that lots of stuff needs to come through level 2, level 3 in order to get to here. But actually, there's also some really interesting tech for us if we were attackers in level 2, level 3. And one of those pieces of tech I haven't mentioned yet, but it's the fuel terminal automation systems. So the fuel terminal automation systems are basically the brains of the fuel terminal. They control everything from drivers driving up to the gate and swiping their card to get access to the facility, through to them loading their tankers, to them getting their bill of lading when they leave the facility. So they're basically critical, and they're very integrated into all of the tech that's within the terminal. And the thing that's really interesting with them is whilst they sit in OT land, they somewhat straddle the IT and OT boundary. So this is just some marketing material that I pulled from a website talking about FuelFax. FuelFax is a very widely used terminal automation system, very widely used across the US, across Europe. And if we look at some of the connectivity that it's got, we've got things like our SAP system, so our ERP, you know, the system that your business migrated into the cloud 5-6 years ago. So maybe we've got some connectivity from OT into some cloud world. Your terminal automation system holds details on your trucks and your drivers. Well, if other people are loading from your terminals, are they your trucks and are they your drivers? Because if they're not, who's keeping those details up to date? Are you providing an interface to a third party to modify the data in your terminal automation system? And then when it comes to the orders for drivers who are going to pick up from your terminals, how are they getting in? Are they magically just appearing in your terminal automation system? Because they've got to come from somewhere. So you kind of get the point. There's lots of routes in and out that need to exist for a terminal automation system to actually function. And with that being the heart of the fuel terminal, that to us as security people is obviously a real concern. And for us, it was enough of a concern that we kind of needed to do something about it. We needed to understand, firstly, whether we should be concerned. So we went and had a look at a bunch of terminal automation systems. And because I mentioned FuelFax on the other slide, I should probably highlight that FuelFax isn't one of the terminal automation systems we looked at. It's on our list to look at, but we hadn't looked at it yet. So we went looking for flaws and vulnerabilities and weaknesses in these terminal automation systems. And it became really clear early on that we were clearly the first people to ever look at this tech. Like, everything we were finding was 0-day. The security posture of some of the systems that are really widely used in the industry, I would describe as horrendous. It really wasn't good. And that was when we were just looking at the components that were relevant to the attack paths that we cared about. Like, we certainly weren't looking at everything. So that to us was a real problem. In fact, it concerned us a lot, and some of these issues were really fundamental, actually, to the architecture of the terminal automation system. So fundamental that our concern was, even if we shared these with the vendors, we had no confidence that they could fix them in a time frame that was reasonable for us, or in a manner that didn't mean we needed to massively re-architect our terminals. And re-architecting terminals doesn't happen overnight. So there was a whole load of complications with some of the things that we'd found, that actually it led to something that even now really challenges me. But we kept these flaws to ourselves. And as someone who spent many years practicing responsible disclosure, coordinated disclosure, that was a really difficult one. But the way we very much saw it was, well, we're in a situation whereby the more we look at this tech, the more we find. And we haven't looked at everything. So if we then get a vendor to fix the stuff that we know about, all we do is create a situation that when a threat actor comes to do their research, they're going to find more flaws. It's just the flaws they find are going to be the ones that we haven't yet found. So we haven't been able to do anything about it. Whereas if we leave those flaws unresolved, unpatched by the vendor, and the threat actor comes with their brand new vulnerabilities, brand new 0-day to use in our environment, they'll hit a situation whereby they just don't know that we know what they now know. I think that's right. So when they come to use their vulnerabilities in our environment, we've already got detections and defenses for those, because we've already discovered the stuff that they're using. Because in all likelihood, what they find will be the stuff that we've already found. And like I say, I'm still digesting that one as an approach. It's definitely a selfish approach, but it's a necessary approach. And I think that kind of highlights a point that I think is worth being mindful of when it comes to OT. Like, if your security model around OT is having all of the patches and having all of the updates. That's not a good model. Like, have those if you want them, but you should expect that there's a load of other vulnerabilities and weaknesses and insecurities in your systems that haven't yet been found. So making sure that your defense is essentially zero-day resilient, I think is a really important piece. And that brings us an awful lot down to architecture. But if you understand how someone would attack your systems, you can craft some really, really fantastic defenses. Like, I'm sure we've all had situations whereby we've seen a new vulnerability in tech that we use extensively. And we sit there and go, well, I'd like some more detail so that I can actually do something about this in our environment. Well, we had that situation whereby we knew all of this stuff. We could craft some really, really clever stuff. And at Lab 539, we have our own Cyber Defenders kill chain that basically splits stuff into a few different phases. And we could build stuff for each phase of that kill chain to either prevent something happening, detect something happening, or even react to something happening. So that ability to do something as a result of what we're seeing was just very cool. We liked the stuff we had. So because of their nature, and because you're looking at a process, OT networks themselves, like, detection in them is relatively easy in comparison to IT networks where everything's really, really busy. Like that phrase, if you've used Kali Linux, you'll have seen the phrase, the quieter you become, the more you're able to hear. Like, that's very true in an OT network. I'm sure the Kali guys didn't invent that phrase. It was probably someone else, but that's where I've seen it. And that's very true. If you know your OT network, you can know where there's deviations. Because in an OT network, like, your PLC doesn't suddenly go check its personal email and then download some arbitrary attachment off the internet. That's not what happens. Whereas in IT, you've got to deal with that stuff with thousands of users. It's a far more, like, challenging and different problem. So detection in OT environments can be easy if you understand it. Architecture, on the other hand, I would describe as easy in theory, but not necessarily in practice. And we had the situation whereby the stuff that we're looking at in our OT network that perhaps needs to be accessed from outside of the OT network wasn't in a good state. And typical manner of accessing some of this stuff was web interfaces. So we ended up building out an architecture that we built our own browse down solution, essentially, that tunnels into the network. And to explain some of this a little bit, because it might not be super clear, but I have a rule with our OT networks, which is nothing should traverse the network boundary unencrypted. So anything coming into the environment is actually reverse tunneled via some SSH, which actually then goes through an SRA, secure remote access solution, because then that gives us the opportunity to kill everything at the firewall whenever we want, but it also means things can come into the environments without having to poke any holes inbound into the firewall. Everything's essentially coming out to be tunneled back in, and it's always encrypted. And I think that's a good model. But when you start to make architectural changes to mitigate flaws and vulnerabilities, there's a whole bunch of other things that you possibly hadn't thought about that come into play that need consideration. And for us, one of those was DNS. Because if people are going to access stuff on web interfaces, you probably don't want them typing IP addresses. And if you need to fail over to backup systems or whatever, or you're doing some maintenance, it's kind of nice for the users if they don't have to know that or remember that. So we needed to do something about DNS in our environment. And like, I knew full well, if we didn't get this right, what we'd have is a situation whereby either someone goes, oh, it's easier just to poke a hole through to IT. And there's no way I'm letting DNS go out of our environment, because there's no way I'm giving an adversary an easy C2 channel. And if we didn't think about this, IT would come in and there would be an entire brand new Active Directory domain to manage users, to look after the DNS server, and there'd be a CCM or an Intune integration and delegated access from the IT environment. And all of this good stuff that we've done to do the segmentation would just disappear because we hadn't thought about something as simple as DNS. So what we ended up doing was going, well, we've got DNS resolvers out in IT. Let's constantly poll those for the systems that we care about. Let's constantly poll them for the hosts we care about. And if anything ever changes, let's just push it down to a DNS server in OT. Because that way, nothing ever needs to leave our environment. We're keeping an eye on changes in the outside and we're pushing it back in. And that approach actually is relatively lean. There's no additional management or anything. We're literally dropping one server. And actually, I'd share this with this audience because you might be interested. But we used Lima Charlie to do that pushing of DNS entries. So essentially, cron job sat here running, doing our polling. If anything changes, Lima Charlie reliable tasking to push it back into OT onto the DNS server to do our resolution. And it also means that if IT gets wiped out, it won't be DNS that broke OT because DNS is now self-contained in OT. But a couple of things I forgot to mention as I was going through this. I think one thing that's really key when you're doing detection in OT environments is that flexibility of tooling. Like, there's no tooling in the world you can buy right now that knows what an attack on a terminal automation system looks like. So there's no point going out looking for it because that's stuff that nobody else has done the work on. So you need some tooling that you can go craft your own tailored defenses in. But equally, when you're protecting a process, your process is unique to you. So there might be loads of vendors that bang on about great threat intel in their platform and everything. And I wouldn't say it's mostly useless, but how someone attacks your environment is going to be very different to how they attack someone else's environment. So if you can't understand what the process you're looking after is, then there's no way that you can really protect it and look after it. So I've flown through that a little bit. Like, the main point I really wanted to make with OT networks, as I say from the outset, is my worry is for a few years now, we've been seeing a lot of IT approaches and tooling being directed at OT environments. It's not always wrong, but often it is. Like, OT environments have been built with a focus on resilience and protecting that process. And in IT, rightly or wrongly, the focus is on protecting systems and users. So there's a different perspective, and that discrepancy is actually a bit of a problem. Like, the way cyber's been done in IT has been quite reactive. In OT, that doesn't work. Like, you can't play catch up. If you do, people die. And we obviously don't want that. So I do worry sometimes that there's been a bit of an incorrect assessment of OT networks made because they're all out of date, running old system, et cetera, et cetera. But they aren't the systems that are getting compromised left, right, and center. So that judgment might not necessarily be applicable. And I guess my big ask from having spent a lot of time on OT security lately is, like, I really appreciate the drive to do better at OT security, but I also see it as an opportunity for all of us collectively to think, well, how can we do that a little bit differently, rather than going, well, how have we done that before? Because actually we're solving a slightly different problem, and it's actually quite refreshing to be able to approach something a little bit from scratch rather than digging up ways that we've done it in the past. I think that's all I wanted to share with you. Thank you for listening.